this is like the way that a trendy purse like takes off within a certain niche group of people. Like fertility tech is taking off. Like these people are going to dinner parties. They're telling their friends, oh, we use this new pre-implantation genetic testing service. You got to try it. And they're trying it. And then they're telling their friends.
Right. So there's like this very vanilla version of this, which is like having babies is good for the economy. It's good for economic growth. It's good to make sure that there are workers to take care of us as we age. And then there is a sort of more racist, more eugenics-oriented version of it.
Yeah, so Orchid is a company I wrote about. I did speak with a few customers who did tell us that IQ testing was something that they had been offered by the company. The company did not confirm this themselves.
Casey, we're going to talk today about something that has been a very hot topic in Silicon Valley recently, which is babies.
Kevin, I don't know if I'm ready to have a baby with you. I'd really prefer to take it a little more slowly. We already have the podcast.
That's true. That's our baby. Mm-hmm. No, we are talking today about fertility technology because this has become a big topic within the tech world. For years, there has been this conversation in the tech world about what's being called pronatalism, which is this belief spread by Elon Musk and others that declining birth rates in the U.S. and elsewhere are a big threat to the future of civilization, and we should all be having way more children than we are, and people are sort of taking this banner in the tech industry and saying, well, maybe some technology could help us here.
Yeah, well, and also just, infertility is a huge problem for a lot of people, right? A lot of people want to have babies and cannot. My boyfriend and I have been trying to get pregnant for many months now and just getting absolutely nowhere. So I'm excited that Silicon Valley is finally, paying attention to this issue.
Yeah, this has been an area where investors, tech founders, startups are just spending an inordinate amount of time recently. Investors have poured hundreds of millions of dollars into startups working on technology to help people conceive and have children. These are things like very specific types of genetic testing that can test a whole embryo's genome rather than just for a few sort of specific things. Sperm freezing and even sort of these longer-term moonshots like artificial wombs and something called IVG, which would basically allow you to make a gamete from sort of non-reproductive cells, to basically take some other cells from a body and use that to create a child.
Which, among other things, would let same-sex couples create a child that contain both of their DNA.
So, as we know, fertility and babies and birth rates, they are not just a topic of conversation in Silicon Valley. They are also playing a role in the presidential election as people debate, what kinds of restrictions and laws there should be about women's reproductive rights and health. So to talk about this subject, I wanted to bring in Julia Black. Julia is a reporter for The Information, and she wrote a great piece a few months ago called Dawn of the Silicon Valley Superbaby, which was about sort of all this investment and energy going into fertility technology right now and what it would mean for the pronatalism movement and what it would mean for fertility as a whole. Let's bring her in. Julia Black, welcome to Hard Fork.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan.
Oh, thanks so much. So can you just start by telling us how you got interested in this world of fertility tech?
Yeah, this started for me in a sort of unexpected way in 2022. I got a tip that kind of changed my life, which was that Elon Musk had more kids than the public realized, and some of them were with people who had not been previously disclosed. So I went out searching and found some secret twins that he'd had with one of his employees, Siobhan Zillis. And that just kind of sent me down this rabbit hole for the last couple of years, where I've learned about Silicon Valley's interest in fertility tech in particular. And then I've learned about some of the technologies that are coming out of that interest.
And let's try to sketch out that interest a bit. So if you are a pro-natalist, what is concerning to you about declining birth rates?
So I think a lot of economists would agree that there is some concern around the fact that the majority of developed countries now are below what's called the replacement rate. And when you structure that into an economy, something happens that they kind of call the flipped pyramid, the flipped demographic pyramid. So you've got more old people, fewer young people, and young people are the people who drive the economy, who are putting into Social Security, who are taking the jobs. And old people are more of a weight on society. So that's the general concern at its most basic. I think a lot of people take this in some pretty wacky and sometimes dangerous directions. The white supremacist movement has become particularly interested in these demographic shifts. And some people, I think, would argue that it's not just that we all need to have more babies, that certain types of people should be having more babies, which translates to white, educated, well-off people.
Right. So there's like this very vanilla version of this, which is like having babies is good for the economy. It's good for economic growth. It's good to make sure that there are workers to take care of us as we age. And then there is a sort of more racist, more eugenics-oriented version of it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that this fertility tech as a field has gone from this totally ignored, underdeveloped realm of technology to something that's finally attracting investor interest. And yeah, it's also attracting some weird ideological interest. So there's a few different elements bundled up in there.
Yeah, there was a quote in your piece that was sort of attributed to an anonymous meta engineer who said something like, "No one is having children naturally anymore." And that's obviously not true. Some people are still having children naturally, but it did sort of give a sense of like how pervasive this has become in the Bay Area where we live and in the tech world more broadly.
Totally. And, you know, the information where I write, our audience is all Silicon Valley all the time. So when you're talking about our small niche world, that's actually really true. And that's the reason we put that quote in the story, because it really kind of exemplified what we're hearing across the board, which is like, this is like, you know, the way that a trendy purse like takes off within a certain niche group of people. Like fertility tech is taking off. Like these people are going to dinner parties. They're telling their friends, oh, we use this new pre-implantation genetic testing service. You got to try it. And they're trying it. And then they're telling their friends. And it's like within this very small and non-representative community, yeah, it really has taken off.
Yeah. Your piece made a point that I hadn't seen before about the fact that crypto entrepreneurs, people who are interested in cryptocurrency, seem especially interested in fertility tech. Brian Armstrong, the CEO of Coinbase, has invested in Orchid, one of these startups that is doing sort of embryo genetic screening. Vitalik Buterin, the co-founder of Ethereum, has also invested in Orchid. So what is the crypto fertility connection?
Oh my gosh, this has been like such a head scratcher and obsession of mine, and I've been trying to figure that out. The best understanding I can come to is that the crypto world is also really interested in something called decentralized science, DeSci. It's kind of taking off in places like San Francisco and New York, but also in special economic zones like Honduras and El Salvador have a couple of these, Prospera, where people are experimenting with new scientific techniques that might not pass muster with FDA regulation. There's like a big backlash to the FDA in this crowd. So that's my best guess, is that like this is a world that overlaps very much with that kind of Brian Johnson longevity obsession. He's a big DeSci guy.
He's the guy who does the blueprint sort of method. He's the guy
one
who's
who
like
literally
reverse
sells
aging.
snake oil.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
He's invested, basically, all of his energy and money goes into de-aging himself.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that another particularity about this kind of Silicon Valley audience, and maybe more so the crypto crowd, is like they just want the best of the best technology now. They want to live in the future now. And so they hear about these technologies that might be possible, but might feel far off. And, you know, they're going to do everything they can to optimize and, you know, optimizing their own fertility or reproductive process is like, why not? So I think especially with the genomic stuff, and especially as AI has helped genomics really advance quite quickly in the last couple of years, I think that, yeah, that particular crowd is quite drawn to these very futuristic possibilities.
I mean, I kind of get it. Like I was telling Casey before we started this interview, my wife and I have gone through fertility treatment, and it seems like it should be a way to sort of bring precision and control to the sort of random process of conceiving a child. But there's so much about it that is still kind of guesswork, and let's try this thing and see if it impacts this thing. And like, you know, it's frustratingly inexact. And I can see if you are a person who's spent your whole career trying to sort of optimize systems and eliminate chance and kind of program things, like this technology would seem like a way to sort of bring order to what could otherwise be a pretty frustrating and chaotic process.
Yeah, and I think I'd also note that there's a whole gamut of new fertility-related technologies that are coming to market.
Is that like a gamete pun that you just did?
God. I did have gametes in my notes here. I was going to talk about them later. I was just going to say that there's this like spectrum of types of technology, and some of them are really far out there, really advanced, like artificial wombs and something that a company called Conception is working on to try to make gametes out of stem cells, which means like two men could, in theory, take skin cells, use them to create an egg and sperm and reproduce using those cells. Like, it's really far out there. That stuff is nowhere near possible at the moment. But I'm just saying, like, you are seeing people in Silicon Valley working across the board on, current possible things versus like totally out there futuristic technologies.
Yeah, and it's sort of far out there in the sense that this stuff does not exist in any form that consumers can use, right? But there are serious people investing in it. Like Sam Altman is someone who has invested in this kind of what they're calling IVG, this sort of using non-reproductive cells to essentially grow babies, right?
Yeah, and I think another name I would bring up is George Church. He is like an absolute pioneer of the genomics field, and he's got a hand in a lot of these companies. And I had the chance to talk to him, and he was actually the one who kind of hinted to me that artificial wombs, which he's currently developing for his other company, Colossal, which
they're trying to bring back the woolly mammoth, right?
Exactly. Which, you kind of scratch your head and you're like, what's the market value of bringing back the woolly mammoth? But then you wonder,
he's going to try to command an army of them and take over some small nation.
Yeah.
I'm sure Elon Musk would be interested.
So, Julia, let's talk about these actual tools that you wrote about, some of the fertility tech that is on the market or will soon be on the market. Talk to us about Orchid.
Yeah, so Orchid is a company I wrote about in July with my colleague Margot McCall, and they're doing something called PGTP, which is pre-implantation genetic testing for polygenic disorders. This is not totally new to the scientific realm. In fact, we've been testing for things like Down syndrome, which is a pretty simple disorder that's easily detectable early on. Then we also have done testing for monogenic disorders. That's things like cystic fibrosis. But now polygenic disorders start to get really complex. This is stuff like schizophrenia and bipolar, diabetes. And so what they're claiming to detect for is the risk factor for these diseases. There is some speculation in the scientific community about how much of this is really possible. And yet, this company has got a lot of investment and has now reached a lot of consumers and is expanding actually to be nationwide. They have some partnerships with nationwide clinics.
How much does it cost to get your embryos tested this way?
It costs $2,500 an embryo. So currently,
and that's on top of what you're already paying for IVF, right? So this is not something that's sort of like mass accessible yet.
Exactly.
But it is part of the core American competency of making healthcare more expensive for everyone at all times.
We've got that
Kevin,
under
for
control.
the price of a mid-range MacBook Pro, you could know everything about the genetic predisposition of your future child. Seems like a small price to pay.
Yeah. So,
well, of one embryo. And of course, you're not just looking at one embryo.
Wait, how many embryos are y'all implanting in a typical situation?
Well, you're probably just going to implant one.
Got it.
The idea is that you want to test a range. So let's say a couple during the IVF process creates 8 viable embryos. So then this company is offering to test each of those for $2,500 a pop.
So it adds up.
Yeah. So then they're going to look at those tests and start to compare them and say, okay, this one is more predisposed. They're not saying that this kid's going to have this disease, but more likely to have type 1 diabetes. Whereas this kid maybe is more likely to have bipolar disorder. So it gives you this like chart, which is supposed to be this risk picture of your child's future.
So actual like babies have been born using this pre-implantation genetic screening, right? This is not theoretical. There are children out in the world today who were born after being tested this way.
Correct.
Okay.
So as embryos, they were tested, and then they were the embryo selected to be implanted.
How many babies has this been performed on? Like how widespread is this?
Orchid wouldn't give us a number, but I think a lot of parents are especially interested in this when they have genetic disorders that run in their families. One really common one is the BRCA gene, which is responsible for breast and ovarian cancer in many cases. So, that's one use case example. Elon Musk, something else we did discover through this piece is that Elon and Siobhan, the parents who I originally discovered 2 years ago, did use this. I don't know if they were using it to test for complex hereditary disorders. I did speak with a few customers, as did Margot, my colleague, who did tell us that IQ testing was something that they had been offered by the company. The company did not confirm this themselves, but this is something we heard.
What
from
does
a few
that even
customers.
mean? Like you can there's some sort of gene that if it's present, you're likely to have a higher IQ as an adult than an embryo without that gene?
So remember that part when I said the scientific community is very skeptical of some of these claims? That would be the chief one. I think that the idea that you can detect intelligence in an embryo from what is a very complex picture of a combination of many genes, yeah, that's very much up for debate.
So I can understand why parents who had that history with cancer that you just mentioned would want to know if their future child was going to be at risk for that and would be willing to, pay a high price to try to avoid that. At the same time, I imagine that there are other more kind of nice to have features that these parents might be testing for, or things that sort of stray a little bit closer to the eugenics line that we were, talking about at the top of the interview. So are these services able to sort of go in a bit of a like darker or more concerning direction, or what have you heard about maybe potential misuses of this screening technology?
Yeah, I mean, I do want to be really clear. If you go to Orchid's website right now, they lay out very clearly the services that they claim to offer. I think it's something like 13 factors, and again, it's the things like diabetes, bipolar risk. So they're not claiming publicly to detect IQ. For whatever reason, several different customers brought that to us and said that it was part of the package they received. Yes, so I do think a lot of people, a lot of bioethicists would argue that we enter this slippery slope territory where, it's one thing, as you say, to make sure that your child doesn't die of some horrific rare disorder. It's another thing when you start to get into the realm of, characteristics of their appearance or their intelligence or behavioral traits. And I think that even something like bipolar or schizophrenia is inching more towards like behavioral traits. In fact, when I wrote a piece 2 years ago about a different company called Genomic Prediction, I spoke with this couple, Simone and Malcolm Collins, who again were doing some of this decentralized science DIY stuff. They were taking the data that they got from one company, plugging it into another genetics company that was actually not supposed to be for embryos, but they were able to upload the data as if it was a person. And they showed me their spreadsheets, and it really was just wild how many factors they claimed to be detecting. They were talking about things like brain fog and propensity for headaches and mood disorders of various kinds. And so, yeah, some people are starting to inch more and more into that territory of these very complex characteristics that make up who we are as human beings. And yeah, you would hate to see it fall into the hands of someone who wanted to detect for blonde hair and blue eyes.
Right. Are they able to detect the propensity of an embryo to start a podcast later in life?
Yeah, no one's selecting for that.
Out of the gene pool. So I just have a question about the politics of all this, right? Because we're at a moment where there's a lot of discussion on the national political stage about reproductive rights and abortion rights. There are some Republicans who don't even think that we should be doing IVF, that's sort of a bridge too far. How do the people who are pushing for this kind of investment in fertility tech square their belief that this technology should be able to exist and be able to help people have more children with the very real possibility that some elected officials want to make this kind of thing illegal. I'm thinking in particular about Elon Musk, who is backing Republicans who would make it much harder for women to access reproductive health care of all kinds, but also wants there to be this population boom because people are able to have more children. So how do they square that belief?
I think we're watching that play out before our eyes right now. I mean, a phrase I think of a lot in covering Silicon Valley's kind of move towards the right is strange bedfellows. Like, you are getting these alliances that in so many ways don't make any sense. A couple weeks ago, I was at a tech conference in San Francisco, and they had the Heritage Foundation like up there with these AI founders. And like, they did in fact have a panel on fertility, surprise, surprise. And there are just so many incompatibilities that I really don't know how they're going to square them. The IVF question is, of course, the main one that is going to come up in terms of very tangible policy very soon. Yeah, I don't have much of an answer except like they're going to be in for a rude awakening, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the question that a lot of people have about this topic is like, how far are we actually from the kind of science fiction sort of Gattaca scenario where like you are a well-off person, you want to have a child, you kind of like go into the fertility clinic and you just kind of get like a menu. And it's like, well, do you want your child to be 6 feet tall? Do you want your child to have a high IQ? Like that'll be another $500. Like, how far are we from the scenario in which people, or at least, you know, wealthy people with access to good reproductive health care will have the ability to kind of select traits for their offspring?
Yeah. So again, I think this comes down to two questions. One is, when is the technology going to get there? And I think a lot of people in this field would argue sooner than you think. And then the other is, when is society going to get there to a place where we actually want that and where our lawmakers actually make that possible.
And already it seems like it's starting to become a bit of a status symbol. Like, I think your story gets at this, where it's like friends love bragging to their friends that they just spent $20,000 on genetic screening for their embryos, and what, you didn't do that for your embryos? You know, so to me, I feel like part of that Gattaca world has actually already arrived here, Kevin, in at least some fashion.
Totally. Well, and I think what people don't maybe realize, unless they've gone through this kind of fertility process, is like there is already a kind of report card that you get back when you have embryos, and they sort of tell you like, this embryo has this grade. There's already a lot of choice at the sort of on the frontiers of fertility today, but what we're talking about here is sort of a very different possible future, in which it's not just screening out sort of the most debilitating, and harmful genetic conditions, but it's truly getting down to the level of like, how tall do you want your child to be? Do you want them to have a higher risk of bipolar? So something like that feels just different fundamentally from what exists today. But maybe maybe people, 20 years ago were saying the same thing about the testing that now seems pretty commonplace today.
I mean, I will say this. Women's bodies have always been this political battleground that attracts controversy kind of no matter what. There have been ethical debates over everything from IVF to epidural use. So, on one hand, like, if it's going to have to do with women and reproduction, it's going to be controversial. But on the other hand, there are some very real ethical concerns here that should be addressed and should be regulated very thoughtfully. And I fear that, like with so many things happening with tech, like with AI, as we've all seen, the regulators are probably behind on this, are probably not working at the same speed as Silicon Valley innovators. So yeah, they probably need to do some catch up.
Yeah. Well, Julia, thank you so much. This is really fascinating, and it's a story I hope we'll keep track of as it continues to develop.
Yeah, it was great to meet you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Hey, that's the end of this clip. If you liked what you saw, head on over to our page and subscribe, and you can get the full podcast. We do a show like this almost every week on tech and the future. Head on over there now and subscribe.